Now, to speak with us today, we are privileged to host one of the most distinguished scholars from Canada and in the field of international relations in general, Dr. Paul Evans. Professor Evans worked at the University of British Columbia in Canada over decades, where he served as the director of both the Liu Institute for Global Issues and the Institute of Asian Research. And also he spent a lot of time in Hong Kong U, I think that at least 3 months, but also every summer, before COVID. He played a crucial role in launching the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs in 2017. I hope that you will provide some guidance as the Hong Kong U also moving that direction for a new school. His recent writing and advising have focused on the securitization of university research exchanges and the collaborations with Asia, including China. Professor Evans is also no stranger to the broader policy community, having co-founded several key initiatives. His rare combination of deep academic expertise and the practical policy insights has positioned him as a bridge between Canada and the Asian academics and the policy communities. His presence today underscores our commitment to fostering in-depth discussion on global challenges and engaging with thought leaders who shed invaluable light on the rapidly changing world in which we live. We are also delighted to be joined by today's moderator, my dear friend and Professor L. Reyes, an adjunct professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration, and a senior fellow at the CCCW. He's also scholar in residence at the Asia Society Hong Kong Center. Early in his career, he worked in the Canadian government and helped to set up and lead the Asia Pacific Policy Planning Unit at the Global Affairs Canada. We usually call it the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but that's the name. It's referred to the Foreign Policy Establishment in Canada. Please note that today's event is on the record. So all of us welcome, all of you welcome to make reference of the discussion in the event. Feel free to take photos during the event, but no video are allowed. We will post the video later on the center's website. After Professor Evans' talk and discussion with Professor Reyes, we will open the floor to audience questions. I have to leave a little bit early because we have the job search at our department. I serve as the committee member. Finally, in preparing my opening welcome remarks today, I found a quote by one of Professor Evans' former students. I'm sorry that actually, forgive me, another quote. And Professor Evans is always illuminating, never dictating, and often sharing a laugh. End quote. So, so we are lucky to have him here to illuminate for us today, even in the challenging and difficult time in many parts of the world. Please join me in giving him a warm round of applause. Welcome.
I feel that I'm at home. My return to Hong Kong has been delayed by several things, but I'm glad to be back here. I had the opportunity to teach some courses here and to get to know the faculty and the city better. I began coming to Hong Kong in the mid-1980s, but it was really my intense experience during my time at Hong Kong U that laid the foundation for the teaching I did subsequently in designing courses on China in the world and on global China and world order. And I've always been very grateful for the opportunity to develop those courses here. I wish we were meeting at a better time. I don't know your personal reactions, but I think most of us share the views of Li Cheng that this is a turbulent, difficult, and dangerous time. The world order that we have somewhat known and largely appreciated is being turned on its head in by a new American administration and a particular president. And this was going to be a talk fundamentally about Canada. Is my voice all right? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. It's fun. I'm going to get to Canada-China relations, but it's impossible and unrealistic not to frame the next phase of Canada-China relations in the context of broader shifts in world order, and particularly Canadian reactions to our southern neighbor. So how to frame what is going on? The shock and awe of the first day of President Trump's, after he was sworn in as president, was a shock and an awe to a great number of Americans. What we're talking about today is international relations, but the biggest changes are happening inside the United States itself, and the overturning of rules, principles that have been in place for a long time, some new policies, but an erosion of many of the elements of a liberal democracy. In fact, my view is America is slipping towards a form of authoritarianism in which the state is weaponized against enemies of a regime, and a number of other indicators that we all regret but are sadly there. So the big story is what's going on inside the United States. The secondary story is what is going on with the United States and almost all of its partner countries or adversary countries. And the third dimension is global order, the institutions and the norms of order. So this, to use an American basketball metaphor, is a full court press against the domestic and global order that we have lived with for certainly all of my lifetime, and largely since the end of the Second World War. I've, for the last 60 days, been away from Canada. I've been in Southeast Asia, visiting 5 capitals, initially leaving in early December from Canada to talk with our Southeast Asian friends in government think tanks about what we were going to do to prepare for a new administration. And smack in the middle of that trip, the day Trump was inaugurated, came the Great Shock. And that Great Shock was with Canada as a central target, Canada, Mexico, on the tariffs. And suddenly, where visits to many of the ministries, people are very polite to Canadians, but we're not vital to them. After that day, Canada suddenly was top news because the tariffs, as they were unfolding, had a dramatic shock on the whole trading system. But Canada and Mexico were first in line on that. And so what Canada was, the nature of the tariffs, the Canadian reactions to them, where we were positioning ourselves or might position ourselves, suddenly Canada mattered. And that's something we can, if we'd like to talk later about what those tariffs were, what they are, what they might be becoming, we can do so. But more importantly, and a big surprise to me, was that in every conversation, they talked about Canada and tariffs, Trudeau's pushback against them. But they also talked about Trump's comments on Canada as the 51st state. And it's something that at first, I think many of us thought was a kind of bad, lame joke that wasn't going to be repeated. In fact, it has been repeated. Mr. Trump has now on 17 occasions talked about Canada as the 51st state. And it's not a threat for military invasion, at least not yet, but the commercial annexation of Canada. And that I can't overstate how dramatic an impact that has had on Canadian feelings and attitudes. The feelings, the emotions of your best friend, your close trading partner, wanting to rip apart the contracts, the deals, the integration of 2 economies. Canada and the US are more integrated than almost any two economies on earth. To have that ripped apart was a hit to the mind and to potentially the pocketbook. But it was the emotions that it has released of nationalism, of a form of anti-Americanism that is somewhat underneath the surface all the time, but has come to the fore. The emotions of betrayal, abandonment, and a realization that the assumptions about Canadian economy and security that have been taken for granted since well into the Second World War, that's over. It's been ripped up. We're in a new situation, and in some respects, home alone. Now, the hockey games where the American anthem has been booed, where in a US-Canada hockey tournament that's underway now, the players engaged in a big fight at the beginning of the game. This is in some ways funny, but in another way is a symbol of this immense shock that has hit Canada. And the phrasing that has been used by Trudeau, our outgoing prime minister, of not an economic conflict with the United States now, but an economic war with the United States. Provinces boycotting products, thinking through new ways. There's no united approach yet to where Canada can position itself in this. But it is clearly the case that Canadians are thinking about that, and most importantly, want to reposition themselves in it. Because the calculation, it's not just an emotional reaction, it's a general, but not unanimous, but a general understanding that Trump is an aberration, but not an anomaly. That we had seen certain forces operating in the United States domestically, a deeply divided society, a MAGA world that is gaining traction. We had seen developments in what many Canadians see as a dysfunctional American society. And at the same time, many Canadians had seen over the last decade an erosion of democratic institutions in the United States. So there's the view that this isn't for the short term. It may reverse slightly if elections go a different direction in the United States, but that America first is here to stay, and how we're going to adjust. Now, America first won't necessarily want to annex Canada. Some may. The annexation thesis. To Canadians, when Trump uses the language of manifest destiny with reference to the North American continent, this takes us back to the 19th century. And my personal view is that a way to, as much as we can make sense of the amalgam of thinking inside Mr. Trump, is that this is back to the 19th century. It's a century of imperialism, of American manifest destiny, and of Monroe Doctrine, and a view that international norms and practices are for the taking, that you can change the rules of the game, that great powers will do. In any case, I mention this because I think these changes and the calculation that we've got to get a mind around these new challenges that aren't going to fundamentally go away is going to color what I'm going to say about Canada-China relations coming up. And in the background, we have no idea how this is going to play out, these shock waves that are running through Canada and through Southeast Asia. My goodness, the things that they were telling me in Malaysia about their worries on tariffs, their views about Gaza and other things. All of you can come up with 10 reasons why you're concerned about what is happening internationally. But that in Canada, the fundamental debate that is just starting to emerge is in light of these factors we're talking about. What's Canada's course? One course of action can be diversification of our relationships, change the economy, try and trade elsewhere. Canada does 75% of its trade with one country, maybe not so healthy, but a diversification with other markets, deeper connection with the Europeans again, trying Asia, maybe trying China. But it's more than that. It's a diversification of international relations. And essentially, how do we think through the existing institutions from the United Nations through to regional organizations for trade, APEC, the whole architecture. How can we think about that architecture when the United States is withdrawing from it, most of it, and trying to pull it apart? What do? Well, we try to create it. And a thesis that is under discussion is what I call the bracketing thesis, is that we imagine international institutions, some we have, some that we're going to have to invent, that don't include the United States. That's mind-boggling, how you bracket the United States and build things with other countries that are like-minded, not necessarily ideologically like-minded, but in terms of functional issues they have to deal with. But in any case, it's a kind of general line. Canada needs to find new friends elsewhere in multiple dimensions. That's one approach. A second approach that is just beneath the surface is in fact just exactly the opposite, is that however difficult our relationships are with the United States, our only way forward is deeper alignment and deeper integration into the United States. That common customs union on defense matters, a complete alignment, imagining common immigration policies, imagining common military actions in on all three of our oceans. It's just a vague idea, but the idea of Fortress America, something that may look unlikely at the moment, but with friendshoring and a closer alignment with a new America in some kind of subservient relationship to the United States, but in the embrace of the United States. And there's 100 other ideas that are floating. But my sense is these are the kinds of choices Canada is facing. Well, let me turn to Canada and China. And when I left Vancouver 60 days ago, 2 months ago, I was going to give a presentation on the kind of a snapshot of where Canada and China are now. And as I think all of you in this room know, it's not a particularly warm state-to-state diplomatic relationship. We aren't having high-level contacts. Discussions are still awkward. This is not the relationship that we knew 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It has been fairly rocky. And I was going to make some comments on how that could be slightly improved. But I think it's worth noting that the state of the relationship is in trade terms. We're doing pretty good trade with China, but we're not changing the composition. And most importantly, on the issue of technology and technology-rich trade and in goods and services, we're not moving anywhere. Canada has lined up with the United States in its controls around technology of imports or investments into Canada and critical minerals. China is blocked. EVs had a 100% tariff from China put on them, but a range of economic things. On technology, we're part of the US strangulation policy on China, more or less. At least we were as of a month ago. On public attitudes, which is something that's very difficult for me to explain to Asian friends. Why is the Canadian public so negative and hostile about China? And we have, even the most recent public surveys of a month ago, China's favorability index is less than 13%. It's less than Russia. And asked the question the Canadian public is asked, do you think we should restrict commercial relations with China because of its current activities place in the world? 70% of Canadians said they want to restrict trade relations with China. So opinions pretty much in the basement. In Parliament, even though it's prorogued for the moment, there's a large element of negativity about China. Xinjiang Declaration on Genocide, some comments about Hong Kong resolutions, and a general attitude among our parliamentarians that if China is not an enemy, it is maybe some kind of adversary. And the concern around domestic interference in domestic affairs led to a series of hearings and a public inquiry that has just come up with its results. So the general picture of public attitudes and parliamentary attitudes is pretty negative. And I'd have to say too, in the context of universities where we are today, that our interactions with Chinese institutions are restricted, not necessarily by government saying you can't do it, but we have in all of our major universities now research security officers who look at any joint project that is going for federal funding or even by this part of the university to go through a security screening process. And I won't get into it unless you're interested what the terms of those are, but they are not only similar to the United States, but in some ways more demanding than the American standards. So we had a situation where finally in our media, in our academic and intellectual discourse on China, it was still very difficult to say anything positive about China or to try for a balanced approach. We've moved the center of discussion over different strategies of containment, confrontation, pushback, and those who advocate something more balanced have been shut out of the public discussion, sometimes through McCarthyite-like tactics and other things through just, there's no audience for those arguments. So that was what I was going to come to talk about and say how I think we can move on each fronts bit by bit. Well, Donald Trump has changed the playing field. Now, I'm not going to suggest that Canada is going to pursue a policy of a wide open relationship with China, treating China as a friend, trying to get back to, in some ways, where we were in the at the beginning of the 20th century. That isn't going to work because on either side, we're not the same place as we were. But the Chinese government has made comments both through the embassy and through in Beijing that this is the time to reopen the relationship, to push it up to a higher level. Let's revisit investment issues. Some of that might come to pass, but I don't think China raising those matters is going to help. But what is going to help and sets the stage differently is a relationship with China, with India, with a number of other countries where we have some bilateral difficulties, is no longer an option that might be nice. It is now a necessity. If we are going to diversify trade, if we are going to try to shape international institutions so that they can have functional effect, we have to have China as part of that picture. And this argument that I'm making won't necessarily convince all Canadians, and it certainly won't in the short term. But suddenly, people are shocked into a realization that this is a hard world that we have entered, and realpolitik is the hard logic of states and state interaction, mean more activities with China. How we're going to set those up is something universities, I hope, can help with. What should we expect? The political landscape is shifting. And I want to give one example that will be important in sort of figuring out what might be the practical steps in Canada. And that's that we are going to have an election in this year. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has resigned. He will step down from office, excuse me. He'll step down from his office on the 10th of March. So that's what, about a month away. And there's a leadership race going on in the Liberal Party for who will succeed him. And I'd suggest to a Hong Kong audience, you pay a great deal of attention to that leadership race. And it's between two liberals, both high profile, very capable people. One is our current Deputy Prime Minister, our former Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who some of you in this room, I imagine, know or have worked with. A very capable woman who knows the economic profile. Ms. Freeland is, in her basic worldview, has been a worldview that the big storyline is the competition between democracies and autocracies. She's Ukrainian by background, fiercely anti-communist, and while very pragmatic on a number of issues. Her fundamental view is the world is divided between authoritarians and democrats. It's going to be very hard to make that case in an era when the United States is going from category 1 to category 2. But it's built into her, the ideological impulse to look at China through the lens of values. The other candidate is a man named Mark Carney. How many of you know that name? Really interesting. More people in Southeast Asia know him. Mr. Carney he's never been an elected politician. He was a banker by background and a commercial guy. I mean, I worked in private sector. Was the governor of the Bank of Canada, but he was also the governor of the Bank of England, a rather extraordinary two-level career, and is a man of high pragmatism, internationalism, and a view, I don't want to put words in Mr. Carney's mouth because he is not speaking about this during the leadership campaign. Mr. Carney has worked very well with China on environment and finance issues through World Bank activities, other things. He's lived in the world, and he's a proud Canadian, a strong democratic values guy. But he's not an authoritarian versus democracy guy. And so if it happens that Mr. Carney wins, which is looking now extremely likely, he has the support of 3/4 of the caucus and 75% of liberals across the country. But seeing him in position will be interesting. Now, the other side of it is that when I left from Canada 60 days ago, I would have given you 90% odds that in our coming election sometime this year, that the Conservatives would win, Mr. Poilievre's Conservatives, almost certain. I would have given you 80% odds that they would have won a majority government. This has changed dramatically in the last 2 weeks. And the Liberals who were down by 25 points are now almost in a dead heat with the Conservatives, and projected out because of the nature of where votes lies in different parts of the country. There's a chance for a Liberal minority government right now. I think there's even a chance for a bigger Liberal government. And the reason is the following. Which Canadian leader would be best positioned to push back against Donald Trump? Bold question. 3 names on the list. Chrystia Freeland. Response, about 12% of Canadians said she would be the right person. About 24% said Pierre Poilievre, the head of the Conservative Party. 60% said Mark Carney. And so my sense is that as the ripple effects of the Trump world run through the Canadian polity, that who can stand up to Mr. Trump is going to be a crucial element. And Carney has a gravitas, a strength, a moderation on matters that may make him the perfect person. As a little aside, and I'll wrap up very shortly. When I was in Singapore, I was talking with them about how in the world do your heads of government approach Mr. Trump? You know, what kind of things, what kind of goodies do you bring to the guy? What kind of promises do you make to them? That was one thing. But I asked this woman who had been a ambassador in Washington, I said, how would you approach Donald Trump? What would you wear? How would you look? What pose would you strike? Would you have your shoulders back? Would you lead with the shoulder? Would you be softer in your demeanor? She said, it's really interesting. So it's going to be hard for any woman. Number one observation. But number two observation was that it really helps if you look strong, if you look like you have a strong jaw. And so we went through Trump's appointments in different positions. Mr. Hegseth, the defense minister, is right. These guys, look, Trump goes for image in his cabinet and his other people. Women are certain kinds of things preferred, but with the males, the strong jaw is absolutely crucial. I mean, these guys look like they're out of Marines recruiting posters when you see them. So we were laughing that we all are going to have to elect leaders that have strong jaws. Mr. Carney's jaw isn't bad. So we'll see where that plays. Now let me finish by trying to do something that's a little bit more prescriptive. What can we do in these circumstances? Well, first is there's going to be a whole lot of conversations happening, basically around the lines that I've just presented, not just with Canadians, but with Southeast Asians, with the Singaporeans, with the Malaysians, with the Thais, with ASEAN people. I think we're going to need a lot more discussions on the institutional architecture, where we're going to go with things like the G20. What does the G20 look like without the United States? Do we call it something else? Even the G7, which Mr. Trump wants to call the G8 because he'd like to bring Russia back into it. Well, maybe not. Maybe we need to bring the Koreans in, recognizing the Americans are going to be a force, but we need to counterbalance. But to start thinking about international organizations, if the Americans stay in them, how do we counterbalance American views on the trading system, American views on international norms, the idea that territorial boundaries are malleable and other places can become American states. In any case, so I think we've got to do a lot more talking. And I think that universities are going to matter in this. It's going to matter for us in the Canada-China relationship to make the case that while certain restrictions are necessary, the emphasis should be on minimizing the restrictions and maximizing the cooperation. And we can, if it's of interest, we can go through some of those specific areas later on research security and what are sensitive sectors and who are sensitive partners. And I think that one final point is going to be important, and it's the information network around China, about China, where the coverage certainly in Canada and many other Western countries is decidedly negative. How is it going to be the case that we can work to bring out the best information globally and get it into our publics and our media? And I think that this center here at the University of Hong Kong is an important element of trying to collect people to present a view that is against the strongly negative discourse on China. Li Cheng and his colleagues, you in this room, know that Hong Kong can play a special role in this. In much of Canada, Hong Kong is now looked at an integral and indistinguishable part of the People's Republic of China. I don't hold to that view. I think there is important room for autonomy and for a bridging function. Two places that I think are going to be most important for us to have deeper discussions of China, coordination of research projects, efforts to hit media, both social and otherwise. One of them is Singapore, and the second is here in Hong Kong. And how we build a network, a kind of alliance pattern of institutes that are interested in a balanced China perspective. We're all going to have to learn how to live with China And we're all going to have to learn how to live with the United States in a new way. And that's going to take a great deal of discussion, intelligence, and perseverance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I very much appreciate the sober message that you provide us, as well as the ideas about how to deal not just with the relationship with China, but speaking as a Canadian, but also with the United States. And I think every country in the world is having to address these twin challenges of geopolitics. I thought I'd start by quoting from a speech that the defense minister of Singapore gave on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference a few days ago. Minister Ng, let me read it here. Quote, "For Asia, the US in the last 60 years since President John F. Kennedy's inaugural speech, that one form of tyranny, and in parentheses, colonial control, will not be replaced by an iron tyranny. That was the moral legitimacy in which US presence was in our region. The US, willy-nilly, has now changed the image, its image, from liberator to great disruptor to a landlord seeking rent." Right? And this caught quite a bit of attention, this quote. And I'm wondering if you, since you spent quite a bit of time recently in Singapore, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, if you could react to this comment, and particularly from your discussions with our friends down there.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm drawing impressions on the 60 or so discussions over the last month, the first thing is that this idea that America is now an exercise in naked national power and self-interest, a form of imperialism, if I use it that way, that to Canadians is shocking. We all live next to the Americans. We know they're hypocritical. We know they don't always do what they say. We know that interest is the iron fist inside a velvet glove. But to many Southeast Asians, they're not shocked by this. They've had the view that that's what the United States is about for a long time. They don't buy the moralism, and several of them are in a certain way embracing Trump's abandonment of values promotion. What the Trump administration has done in destroying the USAID, the DEA, the democracy kind of promotion activities. Trump is taking values off the agenda. And for many of our NGOs, many people in Canada, this is a nightmare. For some regimes, this is a welcome step. It's the Singaporeans don't like being lectured to by Americans on a particular form of democracy, which by any standard now, the Americans have backed away from. The Thais don't like American values coming into the critique of their system. So I think there's going to be a differentiated pattern of response to the, if I can use an ugly phrase, devaluification, taking values out of the equation in international relations. It's not going to be universally negative. Now, it's very difficult for me to think how Americans themselves can swallow this. Americans, we can see I talk about a sea change. I've said, I predicted there's going to be continuity in America first. But remember, not all Americans have gone along with this. Trump he apparently won the popular vote. There's a great deal of unhappiness. All of you have American friends. They're despondent of what's happened. What makes me nervous, however, about that despondency is it is not leading to effective counterforces now inside the United States. Congress has been somewhat pliant and bypassed. It's going to depend on the courts. Values, where are they going to be in the new world? What would they look like? Is this an opportunity for us to move beyond American universal values to something that are more shared values? It's a pretty interesting agenda. Maybe we can do some of that in future.
Paul, you have quite a lot of relationships, strong relationships with educational institutions in the United States, particularly at Harvard University, where you spent a lot of time. Are you surprised at the reaction of Americans to the whole 51st state in terms of how do you see it? There hasn't been that much pushback from institutions, from certainly not from the politicians.
Yeah. Well, let me try that. International reactions to the 51st state proposal. Generally, people laugh. You know, this preposterous. It's just out of the question. But in some instances, it is seen as a nasty but natural extension of the idea of the American state and empire. Remember, the first person that wanted to annex what is now Canada was Thomas Jefferson, and his views at the time that the American Revolution took place. And he said, let's just walk up and take it because everybody would like to be part of what we're doing. Well, that didn't prove to be the case, and there was a war in 1812 that proved it. But nevertheless, just beneath the surface of American politics, there are some Americans who harbor the idea of a natural destiny for the continent. And it's there. Now, my friends at Harvard, by the way, don't think that way. New Englanders are much better because, of course, they were defeated in the War of 1812, a little bit more realistic. But the broader issue of the response of Americans to this, the polls that we're seeing on it are only about 12% of Americans see the value in the annex or the propriety of the annexation of Canada. It's a very small number. But, you know, they're kind of concentrated in certain political parties. Republican support for this is 5 times what the Democrats are. The other thing that has surprised us a little bit, but I'm less surprised than our government officials, is how few foreign governments have spoken out against this. There was more discussion internationally around Greenland and the Panama Canal, which had some similar elements to this, than there is about the future of Canada. And including Britain, including France, no one has jumped up and down to say this is outrageous. They think it's outrageous, but everybody is calculating. Canada is just one canary in the coal mine. And every foreign leader is calculating, what do we say in response to Trump's absurdities? How do we treat them? And many are lying low. Al, in Southeast Asia, as I talk, particularly in Malaysia, the principal strategy of the Malaysian government is to see how long it can duck when it won't be put on the firing lines for tariffs. They were there. And so in essence, not that this will blow away, but that we can't react too soon for being the person or the country where that finger is going to point next, where it's going to point next. And in that context, I don't think we're worried that a lot of others aren't rallying to our cause now. If actually America mobilized in this direction, then I think we will see pushback. Because this would be a destruction of the international order. Gaza's and Lebanon, Greenland, Panama. What makes us all a little bit worried is that the new Trump world doesn't recognize international laws, understandings, treaties. They rip them up at their convenience. And so, while it's unlikely Canada would be caught up in that, it's possible.
We have about 40 minutes or so. So please get ready your questions. If I might keep on just if possible, can I take you up on that whole devaluification issue? As you say, might be welcome in Southeast Asia or some countries, some parts, and other parts of this region. But would it be a case of be careful what you wish for, because you might actually get it? And do we? And I guess it comes down to the question is, do we need that shining light on the hill to provide that kind of values pole star, if you will? We have mixed metaphors and everything. Should we just say, well, do we need that going forward in today's geopolitics?
This is a much bigger topic than we can wrestle with here, but let me take a crack at that question. I think that the metaphor of the shining city on the hill is an interesting one, because it can be interpreted as a shining city that others look at and will naturally want to emulate. And a values agenda in that sense, perfecting, building better domestic societies, is a very powerful and appealing factor in the United States, at least till quite recently. It's how those values are promoted internationally. What are the techniques? Who are they applied to? What I might call democracy enhancement is one thing. Democracy promotion is another. And I think in this new era now, with the US out, there's going to be, so far as values, it's going to be a city on the hill that we try to emulate good values, but we don't force them. And curiously, that plays into some of China's agenda. It plays into the agenda of some countries. But that adjustment may make for a more durable set of values in future.
Right. Daniel, I think you have a question.
Thank you, Paul, for the wonderful talk. And actually, it was a bit less pessimistic than I expected. Two quick questions, if I may. You mentioned that it's important to maximize cooperation and minimize restrictions with China. Which public officials or academics in China are openly saying that? That's one question. And the second, you said that there are some people in Canada who advocate deeper integration with the US, joint immigration and closer alignment. Sounds like almost like a one country, two systems proposal with Canada is that an important force in Canadian politics? People who think that the way to deal with Trump now is to have closer integration with the US? And how likely is that to happen? So those are two little.
Yeah. Thank you. Do you all know Daniel Bell? Everybody nods. I do, and I'm a great fan of his work. Let me try the one country, two systems metaphor. By the way, this is not a Canadian discussion at this point, but that who is promoting it? Daniel, there's been something that has stunned me from the province of Ontario, the premier of the province of Ontario, in an early speech, talked about us having to go back to Washington to convince Washington that we could all be part of, and the phrase was, Fortress North America. Mr. Ford hadn't thought through all of what that might mean. The message and even the vocabulary caused a lot of immediate resistance, nonsense. But when our group of 13 premiers of provinces and territories went to Washington last week, they gave a press conference afterwards explaining what they were doing. And Mr. Ford said, We are here to tell our American friends that we are on their side and that we need to cooperate more deeply with economic relations, a new free trade agreement of some sort. But the kicker was that we want to do this so that we can do common cause in pushing back against China. That it was an extraordinary frame. But by the way, all the provincial premiers didn't believe it, but it was what was said. Imagine that framing the threat from China is greater than the threat from the United States. Now, does that lead to the integration and some of the policies that a few of the intellectuals are throwing out there? Maybe not. But the idea of Fortress North America, common defense, when we see the discussion now of the Arctic, it has shifted from being an area of sort of commercial and environmental interest to one of how can we build up our forces in the Arctic to push back against Russia and China. It's a geostrategic rationale. And so what I'm doing is sort of following through the logic of that as it's going to be explicated by some. What was your first question?
Just on the other end, you're advocating, which I agree with, that should be more cooperation between Canada and China and fewer restrictions. So which public officials and which academics are openly saying as you?
Yeah, there are a few, and I would, Daniel, one of the outcomes of the public inquiry into foreign interference in Canada and Justice Hoag's report is that in the last month, some of our senators, particularly Yuen Pao Wu, but two of his other colleagues, some of members of parliament are now going public on the basis of a recent trip to China. Finally, some parliamentarians went there, and they've come up with a report that starts to seek some common ground with China, lay out areas, including on rule of law matters, for a deeper cooperation with the China side. But it's the public inquiry that's quite interesting, because people are in an era where they like to be frightened. We live in a frightening world, environmentally, nuclear weapons, name your poison. It is a world of concern. But some have started to feel that we can find areas of cooperation. And I'll use several of the people who were involved in the biodiversity conference that Canada and China organized together. Canada didn't want to do it. It did it, and it found the Chinese quite cooperative. On environmental issues, there's probably some reasons we can hope for deeper connections. But the response to that inquiry was interesting. China was recognized as an adversary intent on influencing our domestic system. What was more interesting is that by the end of the inquiry, two things were found. First is that the actual threat and activities from China are less than by other countries, particularly India, Iran, and Russia, and to some extent Pakistan. So that China is playing some tricks that we don't like in our democracy. But on a scale of 1 to 10, they're a 3. India is a 5. But the bigger thing has been the comments that have come out in the last 2 weeks, that if we want to look at where are the external threats to Canadian democracy, where are the influential actors who can influence outcomes, there's a new country on the list. And that's our neighbor to the south. And by any indicator, American influence in Canada, both open but also clandestine through NGOs and MAGA groups and other things, it's enormous. So I say all of this just that there's some cracks in it that I didn't see 2 months ago.
There are questions on this side. this lady, please, and then Edward after.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to meet you, Mr. Paul. So honored to see you today. My question is, who loves last, loves best? China occupied a position of global economic leadership more than 5,000 years, but in the modern society, we suffered from difficulties. America First has already almost become the belief of every president of United States of America, but it's unfair because it will hurt a lot of national interests of other countries in the world or other peoples, considering help the people all over the world or the countries all over the world. We think China and Canada must push some actions to make everybody can listen to our voice, not just listen to America and take action. America wants everybody to do it. And such as the success of the DSIC and the film of the cartoon film named Ananza
May we have
2.
the question, please? Thank you.
Yes, I want Paul tell me what will you do in the future to push Canada and China make a lot of dialogues to learn America know we want peace and development. Thank you.
Well, that's a big subject, and you raised several important matters. Let me take trade and tariffs as an example on this. And that one of the distinguishing features of Trump's economic nationalism is the view that trade is a zero-sum game. One gains, the other loses. Most of the world has come to an acceptance of another view, and that other view is that done right with some rules, regulations, negotiations, trade is positive sum. It can be win-win if it's designed properly. And I think that in that context, curiously, China is not a full free trade country, but it is certainly on the side of seeing the virtues of economic openness. And that's something that Canadians are going to have, we already see, but need to see more. So is there a common point? And it won't just be Canada and China. Most countries in the world have benefited from globalization. Most countries in the world have benefited from relatively free trade between their countries. And if we're going, how are we going to be able to defend that in the case of when the world's largest economy is wanting to play by other rules and is also wanting to be able to rip up rules that they don't like? Free trade agreements don't matter to the Americans, as we've learned. So I think that in that there are some, whether we call them values or common calculations, that an open trading system is worth defending. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Edward, and then we'll go with the back, but Edward, please.
Thank you. Professor Evans. Edward Yao, associated with CCCW, but my previous career was with government. But I'm just, in fact, you touch on the issue of trade, which closer to my heart, and also coming to the question I'm going to raise. The way I see it, the trouble the world is having is, in fact, politics has taken the center stage instead of economics. So politics stupid instead of economy stupid, even at the expense of economic consequences. And you mentioned tariff is exactly the thing, exactly the issue, but even knowingly hurting the economy, but it could be a weapon in politics. Now, you also mentioned that, well, obviously what the US has been doing, particularly against Canada, has in fact a very big pushing force for this great neighbor or big friend to the other side of the spectrum. Unfortunately, I don't think China would be having sufficient pulling force, bring Canada into.
Agree.
No way that. So you have mentioned that, in fact, somewhere in between this big Pacific Ocean, both politically and geographically, is in fact other partners in this part of the world. Canada is part of CPTPP. On this side of the Pacific, we have the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. What's the prospect of using trade, environment, and other issues, non-political issue, and less geopolitically sensitive issue, to bring the world closer? Not necessarily Canada, China. I remember when I was Secretary of Commerce, one of my conversations with the late Jim Carr, which I respect
He was a
very,
good guy.
very dearly.
Wonderful man.
And then later on, Mary Ng, who took over, who has a Hong Kong connection as well, knew her well before she took up the ministerial position. The FTA between Hong Kong and Canada was so remote, although it makes huge sense, right? But the reaction I had with the Canadian government, the first was that, well, could Hong Kong do a free trade agreement without asking China? I told them, well, factually, yes, constitutionally, we can. And we have just completed one with Australia. And yet, I think the political hurdle was so big. So coming back to the question, in the absence of bilateral relations, could multinational sort of agreement as such bring the world closer? And what's your take on the incoming government, be it liberal or conservative? Does that appeal to them at all?
Yeah. That's such an important question, and let me answer it at two levels. The first is in terms of the multilateral or multi-party trade agreements, and you mentioned CPTPP, which we're a part of, which is moving but is relatively slow. But there's a dozen different trade organizations, some of which Canada is a member of, some of which it isn't. And one of the ideas that was coming up in Southeast Asia, and not as government positions, but ideas that were being floated, was the idea of Canada becoming a member of RCEP. You want to diversify trade in certain ways and in certain fields. Try it. Now, we've stayed away from it because we didn't feel it was a high enough value, but also because there was an ideological argument that was seen as a Chinese institution. And I think that argument may just start disappearing. And we'll get into some technical arguments around it, whether it makes sense. Some people in Singapore have advocated that Canada apply for membership in the ASEAN +3 economic arrangements, which again, 2 months ago wouldn't have been possible because they're seen as Chinese being a core partner. We have one multilateralism bracketing China has been the effort recently. I have a hunch that at least there's going to be serious discussion of removing that bracket. So maybe we should start joining everything, including with China as a member. So that's at that level. Your Hong Kong point is really interesting, and I'd like to learn more about it with you and your colleagues. Going back to discussions that I had when I was active on Hong Kong 20 years ago on free trade agreements, what they might look like. It would have been a non-starter 2 months ago to raise this. Is there room now for revisiting this? If some of our Canadian political leaders, pragmatic leaders, see Hong Kong as distinct from China, can make that case to the Canadian public and see it in both places' advantage. I would. Are you going to vote in our next election? I'm teasing you. Just to put you on the spot. But I would say it is extremely unlikely if the Conservatives win, they'll go for any of this. They are still, half of our Conservatives are MAGA people. We have some good, practical, intelligent Conservatives. One of them, John Baird, is speaking here shortly. And he's a very thoughtful, pragmatic Conservative. But in opposition, in their lineup of forces, they are fiercely anti-communist. Now, how far they're going to be able to suppress that in this new world, we don't know. But if I were you, I'd vote Liberal in the next, from this perspective.
So if I could just add that, the CPTPP is exactly an example of that bracketing with the US out of it. The US withdrew from the TPP, and it was brought forward by Japan and Australia, and then Canada came in and insisted on adding the C and the P. So that is a bracketing strategy example right there. The other thing I would just add is that I don't think right now that Canadian ministers or even senior officials can come or are coming to Hong Kong on official basis. Mary Ng, as you mentioned, Edward, she's come here on an unofficial basis as a family visit. But there is still this reluctance to have official engagement with Hong Kong. There was a question over here.
Some students.
Yes. So Lucien, who's a student from University of Glasgow, right?
Yes, I'm an exchange student studying politics.
St. Andrew.
My question is relating to Canada-EU relations. It would seem like Canada and many European countries are in a similar position. I would call them disorientated allies of the US. And what I notice is there's no ideological barrier between Canada and the EU at the moment. And there's great opportunity for closer cooperation.
Absolutely.
However, there is a rise of populism in the EU and this nationalist sentiment we're seeing in many countries. Do you think in the midst of this populism rise, closer ties between Canada and the EU are likely?
That's an elegantly phrased question and a very, very important one. A couple of reactions. One is quite recent. When I heard the American speeches at the Munich Security Conference, Mr. Vance's speech, and that our chairman mentioned at the beginning, and I saw the tears in the eyes of the organizer at the end of it when he said, we are no longer, our values agreement is over with. We're finished. We're two different worlds. Well, might be a slight exaggeration, but the emotions of that were Canadian emotions too. There are a lot of tears over what is happening and the loss. On the trade side, we've got some kinds of trade agreements. Could we talk about doubling it down? Yes. Should we be talking with EU in a different way rather than how we can keep China out of organizations and instead start talking about where we might have commonalities? I think that's going to be complicated discussion, but now it's possible. But we can't forget NATO. I haven't used it yet. It's in all of our minds, what is happening in Ukraine and in the general architecture. Who knows? The winds blow in different directions, different days, different speeches. But we have to start thinking about a NATO-like organization without the United States. It may not come to pass, but it's quite possible. If so, what obligations should Canada have to the European members of NATO in an organization that was premised around our support for the US initially and their support for us? I think we'd have to open it in an interesting way. I think too that it comes into a question of whether NATO should be expanding into Asia. I personally don't think it should, and I would think our discussion around Canada's commitment to particular kinds of norms and order in Europe, there's grounds for that discussion. Canada is very fiercely involved in Ukraine in a way that isn't going to disappear. But I hope when you write your papers here, and when you finish your
For my
studies
class.
here, and when you become a foreign minister in about 15 years, that you will continue to ask these creative questions with answers.
And you'll remember the teachers. If I might just add, Canada likes talking points. And one of the talking points is that Canada is the only G7 member that has a free trade arrangement with all the other G7 members. And that's an interesting position to be in. Are there students around? I know Peter Jung is there, but if I might just get a student and then Peter, yes, please.
My question is that Canada is located in North America, and we have seen that the United States has successfully forced Panama to exit from Belt and Road Initiative just days before.
Yeah.
And so I wonder that how Canada is going to reduce its interdependence on the United States to try to improve relationship with the rest of the world, because if once improve its relation with China, it definitely will face strong opposition from the United States. And as the data showed, the 75% of Canada's exports are to the United States. The interdependence is very strong, and Canada, I'm afraid it might have to bend down when it comes to some issues like Justin Trudeau just did to postpone the tariffs for 1 month. So I really wonder what's your suggestions on Canadian government to do that?
That's a really tough and important question. Any sense of expanding Canada's interdependence, there's certain kinds of things you could broadening away from diversification from the United States. We've been trying it for 100 years with almost no difference in our trading patterns. Is this enough of a shock when the United States actually now starts threatening us with our sovereignty and our nationhood? I don't know, but you're quite right to emphasize the difficulties. These are two economies that are so closely interconnected in manufacturing, in food transfers, in energy, in transportation, in telecommunications, that we're almost one. And to pull this apart is like the worst kind of divorce you can imagine between two people when they're going to, their lives are shattered, some of their lives, and how you divide up the assets. For Canada to change that trade balance 5% down is going to take an enormous effort, and it's going to take years. You don't change your trading pattern away from people you've been doing business with for so long, where the financial intersections are so deep. So it's, in some ways, this is an intellectual discussion we're having, because this is not, the chances of Canada diversifying its economy in any kind of significant way in my lifetime, and I won't tell you how old I am, is very, very small. It's psychological, essentially, at this stage, rather than realistic, but is something you try to hold on to when your best friend has just violated you. So we'll have some work to do.
We're contemporaries, so we're about the same age, right?
But I look younger, Al.
I would agree. Peter,
Maybe not.
Peter, and then Andy.
So I'm Peter Chung, teacher in this university. So I have learned a great deal from your excellent analysis of these very big questions. I wonder if you can tell us more about China. And my question is this. So what does China want from Canada in light of the changing domestic and international circumstances? So what are the specific areas in Canadian foreign trade policy, foreign policy or security policy that China wants you to change so that relations between the two countries can move forward? And what are some of your concerns or difficulties in delivering this to China in light of the circumstances, despite whoever becomes the next premier? Thank you.
That's a big question, but I'm going to collect another question because we're running out of time. So Ian, please.
Thank you very much for very rich and fascinating reflections. I have a quick question in terms of the relationships, future relationships between Canada and China in terms of this notion of scenario planning and strategic analysis. The idea of having scenarios in mind. And I'm just interested, are there people within and beyond the Canadian government that are actually looking at what relationships might be, what they're likely to be, thank you, on the basis of an extension or evolution of current arrangements. And that's the pragmatic approach to scenario arrangements. But the more idealistic one is to say, what would we like the relationships to be?
Sure.
And what would we like them to be like? And that's the crystal ball gaze, and that's the idealistic. And is there much thinking within the Canadian system, politically and within the society, that actually suggests that people are embracing these sorts of issues quite comprehensively and sensibly? Because when you look out to 35, out to 45, maybe out to 55, these issues become absolutely crucial.
Got it.
I'll collect one more question. I'm so sorry. Professor Ying, Ying Chan, I recognize you, but you're joining us for lunch, so I'll give it to the lady. Apologies, but.
From a political science, international relations background, so I try to be very critical or like careful with words like democracy, authoritarianism. So obviously we look at the US, it used to be like a creative democracy, but then like with Trump, it's kind of like withdrawing from like international treaties, so it's adding a bit like undemocratic like. So just wondering going forward, like how do you think these terms kind of like, can they like accurately describe the nature of the state and how, and should these terms kind of like govern how states like interact with each other? Like how much weight do you think you should give to these kind of terms going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we should, we're running out of time, so I think we'll just take the three questions.
You're always sorry you don't have more time. These are rich areas. Peter, your question, what does China want from Canada? Fundamental question. And I think it's varied over time. I remember that when Canada, when we established diplomatic relations in 1968 to 1970, the negotiations, we did some study on this, and we found documents that were signed by all 5 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo at that stage, that Zhou Enlai had initiated and Mao had stamped off on. And it was, why should China want to establish diplomatic relations with Canada? There were several other countries that were applying at the same time, but why did they open the negotiations with Canada? And the answer was alluringly simple. The first reason that Canada mattered was because it was close to the United States, territorially, but also in some attitudes. The second reason was that Canada was somewhat independent of the United States, which gave openings. And the third reason was that China saw Canada as useful in helping it enter the international world in constructive ways. And that was essentially a discussion around the United Nations. So I go back to those, Canada as somewhat close to the United States. Maybe we're not as close as we were in past. Canada is somewhat different, maybe. But that we can be, if I frame the 1968 logic in the context of our era now, that we can be somewhat useful to China in the structuring of international institutions of the future. And it then goes directly to Ian's question about what kind of thinking are Canada and China doing together now? The answer is, I think, less than zero. With some of the environment issues, is a slight exception, but there was a time in the Canada-China relationship when we spent a lot of time at the intellectual level, at the political level, talking with China about international institutions. When it came into the ASEAN Regional Forum in the mid-1990s, we did 3 years of training programs with Chinese diplomats on what are those institutions about, how can you work in them well. In other words, getting China to the table well equipped. That sounds kind of old-fashioned now. China's at those tables. China is at every table. They're better prepared than we are in most instances. But your point is interesting. If we can take the ideological curse off of working with China and saying, do you agree or disagree but can we do some forward planning? I think one of the areas where there is more commonality than is noted generally is on Canada, China, and environment issues, to be sure. Canada, China, and artificial intelligence issues. And just to use one example. But our hurdle and my prayer is that if something good comes out of the last 2 weeks and the new world we're entering, is that ideological obstacle to not talking with the enemy is going to disappear. One bad day in the Taiwan Straits and all of this is off the table. We're back into a nightmare. But if there is stability in some issues, if things don't blow up, I think we can go back to that. And it would be a wonderful exercise to have a great kind of challenge on where are the 3 or 4 big issues where China is open to some other views, where Canada is open to some other views, as we used to have in past. For the political science, Prof, what is democracy? I tried this differently. I gave a speech in Singapore, and it was on the subject of what are the like-minded? This is the diplomatic term of reference to Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy was, we're going to push back against the ones we don't like, that are not like-minded, like China. We're not necessarily destroy them, but push back. We want to work with like-minded partners and allies. Great thing. Well, one of the hidden assumptions in that is what we thought the United States was like-minded, even if we disagreed with it on certain things. And I'm really taken, and I would recommend as a reading, whether you agree with it or not, but it certainly grabs a part of the truth, is the recent essay in Foreign Affairs, the Journal American, by a guy named Levitsky and another University of Toronto professor named Wei. And it was about the slip from that America can no longer be classified as a liberal democracy. What he is saying, they are saying it is slipping towards is competitive authoritarianism with a weaponized state. And for those of us who have, for our lifetimes, seen as a real reference point, the meaning of democracy in the United States, their experiment, or even on their own terms, to be moving in unconstitutional ways, to be moving in ways where the FBI is investigating political opponents explicitly, when the state, the IRS is now going after enemies. This is the kind of behavior we don't associate with democracy. So maybe we need, well, I think our reference point, and it's very painful for our American friends to start looking at them in another light. But I've heard the best critics on this have been Americans themselves, that something has changed in the character of their country and in the character of their institutions that are being eroded. Checks and balances don't work. Congress doesn't work in the way that it was expected. Elections don't work. Plutocrats, rich people are taking positions that overtly benefit them economically. Donald Trump has a meme coin that is worth $70 billion. It's grown up in the last 3 weeks. I mean, this is something that's sort of takes you off the democratic, out of the democratic category. Don't answer me fully. Do you agree in principle with the argument I'm making that the United States is possibly a post-democratic country? Oh, yes or no? That's a sad way to end. I'm sorry.
Right. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much for all of you. I'm sorry for those who we couldn't get questions. Just to close, and I'm sorry, we're a little over time. I would just say that if I put my Canadian hat on, which I don't often do when I'm here, but if I put my Canadian hat on, I would say that, that there's a lot of opportunity for Canada-China relations. I think there's a lot of affinity. There's a good fit there. I mean, we often talk about what China wants, but I think sometimes we should also think about what China needs and what Canada needs. And we have a lot of what China needs, and I think China has a lot of what we need. We need too. And, I think in Canada, it's been difficult to get over the scarring from the 3M's crisis, the Meng Wanzhou, 2 Michael's crisis. That's been difficult. And of course, the issue of, as Paul referred to, the foreign interference. And that really led to Canada's articulating an Indo-Pacific strategy that spent a lot of time on China and referred to China as a disruptive power. It was fair enough, but at least from Canada's perspective. But there has to be in this new environment opportunities. And Paul already identified the environment as really one of them. And the environment and energy, they're really areas that offer a lot of opportunities. China and Canada actually have a long-standing council or framework called the CCICED. Don't ask me what the acronym stands for. It's quite complicated, but that's been going on quite some time. Canada and China actually talking about dealing with climate change and environmental responsibility. And that has continued through all the rocky relationship of the last few years. So that suggests some kind of opportunity. And indeed, strategic dialogues and track 2.5 dialogues have continued, particularly through the China Institute at the University of Alberta and other institutions in Canada. And another bit of good news is Queen's University of Kingston, Ontario will be here this week, and I'm actually meeting with them. So I'm encouraged that they are visiting as well as having Paul here. And indeed, thank you very much, Paul, because not only did you, but you came to my class yesterday, so that was a good, that gave me some time off.
That was a
So thank you very
volunteer.
And before we close, it's time for recognizing your generosity and sharing. So Paul, here's a gift from the Center on Contemporary China. It's China and some documents. So here we go.
My heavens.
Thank you.
Okay, I've never been given a teddy bear. I was 10 years old.
We always strive for